Before we get going on social comparison and self-esteem, I wanted to make a couple corrections. In reviewing my last lecture, lecture 2, I had some kind of fuzzy references that I want to clarify. First of all, I was talking about distinctiveness in situationism, and I used the example of someone going to a yoga group and noticing that they were different than other people. And I guess where I get this is my husband rarely will go to a yoga class because oftentimes he is the only man there and he feels singled out. So I wanted to clarify that because I failed to say that, you know, you're a man in a yoga class and you feel different and distinctive. And the other thing is I wanted to apologize when I was talking about giving examples of interdependent view of self and different adages. I gave you a couple of examples of Asian adages and introduced it by saying you're less likely to have heard these. And what I really meant is that given that we're in the context of a Western culture and a lot of your education may have come from a Western education, that Asian adages would be less likely to be something you'd be familiar with. I don't want to be exclusive and act like I don't have students that come from a more interdependent collectivist culture or even self-construal. So I just apologize for that. And this whole process of doing lectures via video is a humbling experience, let me tell you. You might hear some more apologies. So let's get on to talk about social comparison. And the first concepts to learn about with social comparison. Actually, I'm a little bit ahead of myself here. Let's go back to the actual definition. Social comparison is the hypothesis that people compare themselves to others in order to obtain an accurate assessment of themselves and assessment of their own opinions, abilities, and their internal states. It's again looking to other people, comparing yourself to them, and see how you measure up or don't measure up. So there are two types of social comparison: downward comparison and upward comparison. So downward comparison, if you're comparing yourself to someone that you think has less than you, whether it's less ability or any kind of personal attribute that you can think of, then you're more likely to feel good about yourself. But if you're comparing yourself to people that you perceive as having more of something than you, more money, more status, more toys, more intelligence, more positive attributes than you, then you're more likely to not feel as good about yourself. So which kind of social comparison do you think most people tend to default to? Downward or upward? Seems like most of us tend to compare ourselves to people who have a little bit more than we do, or a lot more than we do. And that can cause some bad results, especially it's been shown that depression and anxiety can definitely be one of the contributors to these kinds of mental states are upward comparison, because it affects our self-esteem when we do that. And that leads to self-esteem. So generally speaking, people that have lower self-esteem report less satisfaction with life, more hopelessness. There's higher incidence of depression and anxiety, and they're less likely to be able to cope with life's challenges. There are two different types of self-esteem: trait self-esteem and state self-esteem. So here we have the general definition for self-esteem as the overall positive or negative evaluation an individual has of him or herself. Trait self-esteem is your enduring level of self-regard that is stable across time. So trait self-esteem there isn't a lot of fluctuation in that throughout the course of your lifetime. State self-esteem, however, refers to the dynamic, changeable self-evaluations that you have over the course of time. So they can just be very momentary mood states or feelings about yourself that relate to the particular situation that you're in. So it depends on what mood you're in, or what state, what situation you're in. That's your state self-esteem. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the sociometer hypothesis. So this is about self-esteem as it relates to social acceptance. So a sociometer is kind of a yardstick that measures how socially accepted you feel. And of course that definitely affects our self-esteem. And I relate this to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and that kind of middle rung of belongingness and love, because I think it's really a crucial need that every one of us really needs to meet. So according to this hypothesis, the sociometer hypothesis, self-esteem is an internal subjective index or marker to the extent of which we feel either included or excluded. So in other words, how favorably others look at us. So our self-esteem increases with social acceptance and decreases with social exclusion. So things like being ignored, being left out, being ostracized are going to definitely decrease our sense of self-esteem. And being included, being chosen are going to increase our sense of self-esteem. Now here's an interesting thing about self-esteem. We've talked about independent versus interdependent cultures. And research has shown that interdependent cultures don't place as much value on self-esteem or self-improvement as Western cultures. It kind of makes sense because they actually don't really have the emphasis on the self as much. The emphasis is more on the community. And there's a lot less emphasis on trying to feel good about yourself and a lot more emphasis about how to make everybody feel good, kind of the collective goals that are going to improve life rather than the personal goals. So we're looking now at self-esteem, and this is entitled More Than Just High versus Low Self-Esteem. So self-esteem is important, but perhaps we put a little bit too much emphasis on it, and we'll see some of the limitations of it by going over this. So research has actually shown that people that have higher self-esteem might possibly be more sensitive to threats and more reactive to insults and challenges than people with low self-esteem. So that's an interesting point. And the first blue bullet there is telling us if high self-esteem is unwarranted, that might make the person feel insecure. So if there's a disconnect between your esteem level and reality, your actual performance, that might make you feel insecure. Another thing is that it might make you less successful. So there was a real movement in the school system where some schools decided for grade school kids they would really play down the impact of grades, either not use grades or really not pay as much attention to grades as they paid attention to boosting all children's sense of self-esteem. The idea is there's an association between high self-esteem and good academic performance. The problem is that this resulted in teachers not really giving children accurate feedback so that they could correct their mistakes and learn from them. So that's one example. And then another example is that people might actually react more aggressively when their self-esteem is threatened if they have high self-esteem versus low self-esteem. And inflated self-esteem is especially counterproductive. Now, I've got prison studies that have been done in trying to boost self-esteem of inmates with the assumption that if we boost criminals' their sense of self, and if they like themselves better and feel better about themselves, then they'll commit less crime. What's really been shown, though, is that in some cases that is true, but in many cases, especially in the population of criminals that are more sociopathic and narcissistic, that actually tends to make things worse, because it tends to make them feel more entitled. So that kind of backfired as well. Next, we'll talk about self-evaluation and self-enhancement. So let's look at motives for self-evaluation. It turns out that research has shown that individuals generally are motivated to view themselves in a positive light, and even to kind of exaggerate their own accomplishments, abilities, and attributes. And this motive is known as enhancement or self-enhancement. And here it's defined as the desire to maintain, increase, or protect one's positive self-view or self-views. So this kind of tends to be a default that most people go back to. It's really a protection of the ego, protects our self-esteem and our ego. And it relates to this better than average effect. The definition of the better than average effect is the finding that most people think they are above average on various personality traits and ability dimensions. So what does that mean? When you ask people, for instance, to rate how well they think other people drive, and then subsequently ask them to rate how they drive, people consistently rate their own driving as above average, better than most people. And it's not just driving, it's just about any kind of day-to-day activity, or if you ask them about a personal attribute, how generous they are, or how conscientious they are, they tend to rate themselves as being above the norm, a little bit better than average. And this is actually happens to be a marker of the well-adjusted individual. So to just have this slightly skewed, slightly unrealistic sense of view of self. Again, very protective of the ego. And this self-enhancement theory, although it generally applies to most people, it applies even more consistently with Westerners that tend to be have a more positive view of themselves. And another thing is that when we rate our own abilities, we tend to weigh the abilities that we're proficient at, that we're good at, as being more valuable than maybe other activities. So that fits in with self-enhancement as well. And I see that we have less than a minute left, so I'm going to save self-verification for next time, and hopefully we can wrap up with this week's lectures next time. Thank you.